of new polling that shows little difference in confidence among voters when asked about President Trump and Joe Biden's ability to handle law and order in America. In the latest Monmouth University poll, 48% of Americans are confident that President Trump can maintain law and order in this country. 51% are not confident. And compared to 52% of Americans who are confident Joe Biden can maintain law and order, and 45% who are not. And on the president's handling of the nationwide protests over racial injustice, just 24% think President Trump has made the situation better, while 61% think he's made the situation worse. 45% think Biden would have handled the protests better as president. 28% think he would have handled the protests worse. And 23% think he would have handled them about the same.
So, Gene Robinson, the fascinating thing about political campaigns is, as Tom Brokaw reminded us after everybody had already said Hillary Clinton's campaign was over going into New Hampshire and she shocked Barack Obama, he said sometimes you have to wait for voters to actually vote before, before calling a race. And obviously, that's something we all need to be reminded of time and time again. We don't know how this election is going to turn out, but we have seen two things happen already in this election, two defining moments. June the 1st, when the president had troops storm peaceful protesters so he could hold the Bible upside down at St. John's Church. And then Kenosha, which ended in tragedy and a 17-year-old out-of-state kid shooting people with his AR-15. Those events and the ongoing riots, I'll call them riots because at times they're riots in Portland, that are happening in Portland and unrest across the rest of the country, were supposed to help Donald Trump. We've seen time and time again, poll after poll, showing that not only did it not help Donald Trump, if you look at polls after June the 1st, or you look at Wisconsin polls since the Kenosha unrest, actually Joe Biden's numbers have gone up and Donald Trump's have gone down.
Yeah, it's, so your basic point is absolutely right. We don't know what's going to happen, and you have to wait till the voters actually vote. My question about those numbers and similar numbers are these attitudes about how Trump has handled this issue or that issue, how Biden would have handled this or that issue, what they're going to do about the economy, this and that. I wonder how much those feelings are moving the needle. I wonder how much of this, to what extent this cake is baked in the sort of split along cultural lines that we have in this country, and you have the Trump base, and whatever they think about what Trump is doing, they're with Trump, and you have the anti-Trump base and the Biden base that no matter what they think about what Biden said yesterday or will say tomorrow, there's no way they're going over to Trump. So, are there persuadable voters in the middle? Is there still a middle in American politics, or are we just are we going to cruise in these lanes until we get to November 3rd? And I think that's a question obviously we won't be able to answer until after November 3rd, and maybe not for a couple of weeks after that.
Yeah, important question. You look at a lot of the polls that show Biden near 50% or above 50%. A lot of those numbers aren't going to be moving. Jay Caruso, how fascinating that we've been talking about law and order, and the media's been talking about that and how that's going to impact white voters in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. But actually, all the talk the last week or two hasn't been about that, because Biden seems to be holding his own there. It's been about actually the Democratic nominee's problems with Latinos in Florida and Arizona. So suddenly you've got in the upper Midwest, a lot of those states still comfortably in Biden's camp, while you have Arizona and Florida going a bit south for him.
Yeah, it's a perfect metaphor for 2020. Everything is just kind of crazy, isn't it? You would think, based upon Trump's rhetoric, based upon things that he's said in the past, his actions that he's taken in the past, that he would be struggling with the, especially in Arizona and Florida. But surprisingly, he's not. He's doing rather well, and Biden needs to make up that ground. Now, granted, Biden, if he wins the 3 states that Trump won, if Biden wins Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, and Trump wins every other state that he won last time around, Biden wins the election regardless. So it's not as if he has to win Florida or he has to win Arizona. But of course, if we don't want a bunch of mayhem after the election, of course, it'd be a whole lot better if either one of the candidates wins big. So I'd rather not see this stretch like Gene was talking about, weeks ahead of November 3rd. I think everybody would want this thing settled on November 3rd.
So, Alexei, this is what the president is going with, this law and order argument against Joe Biden. He's lying about him in many cases when he says he wants to defund police. Joe Biden has said, we'll point out again, that he does not want to defund police. He wants to add money to community policing and to programs that will help build those communities and relieve some of the pressure on police. But the president, as has been laid bare by the Woodward tapes, has mishandled this coronavirus epidemic, has lied about it. That's not my opinion. It's there on the tapes. And also the resulting economic challenges that have stemmed from this. We just did an entire segment about how bad the economy is right now. So this is the heart of President Trump's argument. It's what he has left, is that Joe Biden will leave the cities to burn and that these suburbs will be abolished. Is that getting traction anywhere as you cover these tight races in battleground states?
Well, thank you for having me, and good morning to everyone. I mean, the thing that we see President Trump relying on the most to really cater to that base group of supporters is this fear message that you just pointed out, Willie. But on top of that fear message, he's still pushing this idea that he himself, Donald Trump, is the brand, is the product, that he is once again selling to voters in hopes that he is still an appealing enough product to them. I mean, you see that at some of these Trump vote parades that we've seen around Labor Day. You see that at the rallies that he's still holding when people, print out their own Trump flags that are even bigger than the American flag and drape themselves around, with these flags. So we see how this kind of cult of personality is something that the president is still leaning into. And I think that is working, but it's working with an increasingly small group of voters. To your point, Willie, there are a number of voters and constituencies around the country who have viewed the president's handling of the coronavirus negatively, and they are souring on him and moving toward Joe Biden. Now, that is something crucial that's happening with voters who are 65 and up, who made up like 25% of the electorate in 2016 and are obviously most affected by this pandemic. But it's not enough for the president to just rely on that small group of voters. The question now is whether or not he turns out to a persuasion strategy or just a turnout strategy with his own group of supporters, or a turnout strategy that really just tries to depress turnout among likely Democratic voters.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.